Here, look.
What's it?
Count me in from 5. It's got to be close.
Best. And we're live.
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Doug Bradburn, the president and CEO of George Washington's Mount Vernon. Welcome. We are live streaming from this historic estate right now. You can see the great building behind me here, George Washington's famous cupola on top of this extraordinary house, which I'll talk a little bit about as we spend some time together here live. I look forward to answering any questions you all might have. The fact of the matter is right now, it's really bittersweet for me to be out here. It's sweet first, the good news, right? Because it's a beautiful, beautiful day. I can hear the birds. This place is gorgeous as spring is starting to bloom. The daffodils are coming up. The perennials are coming up in the upper garden. I can see the vinca behind me blooming under the trees. And this incredible landscape that I get to enjoy as if alone, in fact. It's really unusual. And that also speaks, I think, to the bitter part of it. I mean, we are in unusual times here at Mount Vernon. As an institution, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association saved Mount Vernon in the 1850s, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But we've been open to the public since 1860. And there were some disruptions during the Civil War of public visitation, but we've never really had a sustained period like this where we're closed. And in fact, I wouldn't be able to do this right now if we were open this time of year. And what you would see behind me is a long line of school kids, kids on their school trips that have come to Mount Vernon for generations. And in this case, this period in time, from now until the end of June, really, we'd see about somewhere between 250 and 300,000 school kids from all over the nation, in fact, from all over the world. A lot of adult groups as well, and of course, family visitation throughout the Easter holiday period, the Passover holiday, all the great spring breaks that are happening very soon. And so that's the bitter part, because we love to share this place with people all the time. Our mission is to teach them about the preservation we do at this site and about the extraordinary life and times of George Washington in all of its fullness. And so we are still doing that mission. We are still teaching. And although you can't be here physically, you can be here virtually. And so for all the parents out there, I'd encourage you to take a look at mountvernon.org/digital. We have lots of resources for you, for those kids stuck at home. We got our tremendous virtual tour. So you can be like me standing here in front of the mansion, but you can also walk into the mansion itself, hear from our different curators, click on objects that are of interest to you. We also have a great interactive game called Be Washington, which is a chance for people to step into the boots of George Washington. And in fact, you can play this with a group all over the country. If everybody's sequestered somewhere else, you can all play together if you just get a code from our webpage. And there's 4 different scenarios that allow you to walk in the shoes of George Washington during times of crisis. How did he deal with moments when he didn't know it was going to happen tomorrow, when he was dealing with the fog of war and had limited information? What are the choices you would make? What are the choices he made? We, of course, have our incredible digital encyclopedia, which is an ongoing, growing database of stories and entries about all things George Washington, Age of Washington. Some of your favorite historians have written these entries. They cover everything from George Washington's historic estate here at Mount Vernon to the enslaved people who lived here and worked here and made George Washington's life possible, to the battles he fought in the American Revolution, to the cabinet, to so many other items. And you really could spend days crawling through the encyclopedia. It's one of my favorite spots to find the odd anecdote. We have videos as well, videos that have been recorded over many years now. Our media team has been at the forefront of education media, I think, for the last 5 years or so, and really have produced a number of things that show how to make candles, how to spin yarn, how to make blacksmith shop work, and how to do so many other items. And to talk again about the history of George Washington and this estate. For the teachers and the parents, we also have lesson plans available, which can guide you on ways to use materials. How do you teach with an object? What are the things we can learn from a broken sherd of pottery, about the people that lived long ago, about how it was made, how it was used, what it meant to consume these items? And of course, you can see that in all our great collections here. We have an extraordinary collection of 18th century objects in many cases owned by George and Martha Washington, used by the enslaved people here, objects that all tell a story in their own right and can be used to really open up the past in a way that's really tangible for people. It's all there online. Now we are kicking off with my presentation here, which is more of a ramble, and I'll actually start giving you a little bit of history. But we're going to kick off this new live noontime opportunity from Mount Vernon on YouTube and Facebook, every day with a new theme, with a different expert of the Mount Vernon staff and our education team, our horticulture team, our collections team, the library. I want to make sure you get to spend some time with the people who are dealing with the lambs right now. That's very popular and very helpful. And so I also will be involved as much as I can through this period, taking questions and talking about some of the places and the things I really love about Mount Vernon. So the themes we're working with right now is we're going to focus on the mansion on Mondays. We're going to focus on teaching and ways to teach and items that you can teach and lesson plans on Tuesday. On Wednesday, we're going to have Washington Wednesday. We're going to focus on a lesson from the age of Washington, stories about his leadership, stories about his character, stories about his life and times that are going to be dynamic and telling. We've got a tremendous staff here at Mount Vernon who are some of the best experts in the country. Now, Tranquil Thursdays is the theme on one of these ideas, and I think that's going to be a chance to take a little time to reflect and relax and to be together with some of the beautiful things we have at Mount Vernon here, our gorgeous gardens, the lovely spaces at Mount Vernon, and talk a little bit about this place as well. And then Casual Friday. Everything's could happen on Casual Friday. You never know who might show up on a Casual Friday. We're social distancing, so there's only going to be a limited amount of people, but it'll be fun. It'll be casual. We try to keep people's mind off constantly stressing about the news and the challenges that are going on right now. I think that's one of the lessons that immediately comes to my mind when I look at the history of this country and the way we've dealt with extraordinary circumstances. This is going to be a challenge for our community, for our nation, for our world, that will challenge our generation and our spirit. And there'll be a lot of things that are messed up. There'll be a lot of chaos. There'll be mistakes made. There'll be tragedies. There'll be venality. But ultimately, we are an incredibly persistent nation that has a great stock of good feeling for our fellow man. And there's going to be a lot of sacrificing going on as well. And a lot of people pulling together as a community with all our great institutions working together at the local, the national, the international level, but also the public-private partnerships. One of the great things about being a nation based on liberty is we have so many people who are empowered with wonderful ideas and with wonderful opportunities and resources that can be brought to bear when we get ourselves collectively organized. And I think that's what we're going to see together. And so one thing to remember, I think, what history can give us in this time is a real sense of perspective. It can give us balance. It's very common. I was reflecting on Thomas Paine's great crisis essay #1 earlier this morning. These are the times that try men's souls, the famous line that Paine begins that essay with. And one of the things Paine is doing in that essay at a bleak moment in the American Revolutionary crisis, I mean, it is basically lost. You'll remember that George Washington, his army has been defeated in New York. They've been shattered. They lost a lot of lives, a lot of people captured, and they're fleeing against what's unbeatable. Paine writes this essay to help rally the country and give them perspective. It's in many ways, it's obviously a polemical essay that's saying, this is an important time to come together. These are the reason why our cause is still vibrant and it matters. But it's also a historical reflection. And one of the lines in there he has, which struck me, was, it's astonishing how in nations, how rapidly panic can spread in a country. But then he went on to say, and he pointed to specific examples, going back to Joan of Arc, actually, and the panic that she instilled in the English during the 100 Years' War. And in the similar vein, he then goes on to say, but panic can be useful because it can reveal where we're failing and our weaknesses, but it creates resolve and it prepares the mind to deal with challenging times moving forward. So, we're going to see all kinds of challenges moving forward here, and history can be a thing that gives us a little bit of perspective. All right, so let's get back to Mount Vernon. That was my a little editorial op-ed off the cuff here, since they told me just to wind me up and go. So here I'm going. And I want to talk a little bit about this place, where we're at. So here we are in the Bowling Green at George Washington's Mount Vernon. The landscape all around me is intended to look as much as possible the way it looked when George Washington lived here. Now, he died in 1799, but this landscape was familiar to him because he laid it out. It was his design. In fact, the design we maintain now was really instituted by George Washington after he returned to Mount Vernon after the American Revolution. So you remember he famously gives up his commission in this world historical moment when he resigns his sword and goes back to his farm under his vine and fig tree. There's a song about it in the Hamilton musical. He comes back to Mount Vernon and he brings with him a notion that Mount Vernon is going to be a showpiece for Americans about the new Republican taste, the new style of the country. And he's also seen all these different places in the last 8 years all over North America. He's interacted with people from Europe, from all over the world. And he puts in a design here that's intended to, I think, to reflect his latest thinking on what he thinks would be beautiful, what would be pleasing, particularly here on the Mansion House Farm. So Washington is going to engage in a major agricultural reform effort, but the Mansion House Farm here, so he had 5 farms. This main core where the beautiful mansion is, was intended to be not only a working farm, but also a pleasure area. So these areas were designed to enjoy the beauty of nature, to lay them out in a pattern that were pleasing to the eye and pleasing to reflection. And so he designs this beautiful Bowling Green area with the parallel serpentine paths. He lays out his gardens in a new manner to emphasize the importance of the curved line and proportionality. And he lays out views and vistas through what looks basically like woodland. It's intended, of course, to look natural, but it is all designed and all carved out. And so Washington is really here with us when we're at Mount Vernon. We're inside his head, in a sense. We're in a place that he thought about and designed and fretted over all of his life, really. Now, the mansion behind me, the most famous kind of element of this landscape design, is really an extraordinary survivor. This is a home that's built all of wood. Okay, it's not built of stone. He intended it to look like stone, but there wasn't stone available that he could afford in 18th century Virginia. And so it's a structure that he inherited originally. It started as a much smaller home than the one you see behind me. So the main mansion house I'm talking about, when George Washington originally started coming here to live after his brother's death. So I think the date, and you out there with the Googles in front of you can correct me, but I think, it's sometime around 1753, he comes to Mount Vernon, comes comes to live here. He's renting it from his sister's widow, his brother's widow, and it's actually going to ultimately be inherited by his brother's young daughter. Now, Washington farms it a little bit at that time as a Virginia planter would, but he's still engaged in the French and Indian War. He's still engaged in other pursuits out west. And so Mount Vernon doesn't look really anything at that time like it looks today. Now, ultimately, of course, his poor sister will die, and his sister's daughter will die, and then George Washington inherits the estate. And when he inherits the estate, the house that he inherited here basically had 1 floor with a central passage and 4 rooms surrounding it with a small garret. He quickly extended that to include another floor as he had a new arrival coming when he married Martha Washington in 1759. And that marriage to Martha is fundamentally crucial to the story of this place. She brings a tremendous amount of wealth into George Washington's life. Not only wealth in cash, but wealth in labor and enslaved people who come here to Mount Vernon or brought here to Mount Vernon. And George Washington's able, therefore, to expand the agricultural practices on the estate, and he begins buying outlying plantations as well and consolidating what we know today as the great Mount Vernon estate. So when he inherits it, it's roughly around 2,000 acres. When he dies, he has 8,000 acres contiguous on the Potomac River. So today you could drive your car from Mount Vernon down the Memorial Parkway towards D.C. for 10 minutes before you leave George Washington's original 8,000 acre estate. So it was a tremendous estate for the 18th century. And with it came Washington's ambitions to have a tremendous house as well. Now, he never did tear down that original house and rebuild. He added on to it. So he raised the roof. He ultimately dug out a cellar. He extended the wings in the 1770s. And he put a cupola on top in the 1780s. And he put the grand piazza off the back also. An extraordinary architectural achievement, really, for a man who was self-educated. He's all doing this by rule of thumb. He's doing it using a number of books that were prepared for English country gentlemen about how to do this kind of work, and working with master carpenters and craftsmen as is essentially his contractors and sub-architects, working on how to make this happen. And it really is an evolution over the course of his life. So the mansion as we know it, though, would have looked like this from the exterior roughly from the 1780s. So from 1785, 86, 87, I think, is when the cupola comes on, and then it would have been very recognizable. The interior, which you're going to hear more about through this series, is continually worked on. In fact, some of the latest embellishments are done in the interior decorating and design of the mansion in the last year of George Washington's life. So we'll talk more about how he was at the cutting edge of fashion at the time, and he and Martha Washington were projecting an image of what they thought not only fashionable, but appropriate decoration for a young republic would be. So all those things make this a fascinating place to learn about. Now, I understand there's some questions that are coming in, so let's go ahead and take some of those while I catch my breath.
Great, thanks, Doug. So Scarlett wants to know, do you have any book recommendations for us to read during the quarantine?
Okay, so Scarlett asked whether there's book recommendations to be had during the quarantine. Well, first of all, I'm a doctor. Let's remember that in this moment of a health crisis. And I always prescribe more books. I'm not the kind of doctor that helps people. I'm the kind that says you're not reading enough. But at any rate, there's always time to read George Washington, and particularly now when you're at home and looking for some things to really sink your teeth into. Now, I love all the historians who've written about George Washington, so I don't want to upset any of my good friends out there by not mentioning their books. But I think we need to start with the idea of the definitive modern biography of George Washington. Not perfect, but definitive, with the idea being it's trying to cover every story in his life using the latest research at the time. I think still is Ron Chernow's Washington. It's a giant tome. It is a great book to have as a reference. But I think you can go online and look at some of our videos. There's a video of me interviewing Ron, and even he will admit that because he was trying to write a definitive work, it has all these kinds of cul-de-sacs that sometimes don't go anywhere. I mean, that's the nature of a human life. Not everything we do leads to something else, but everything that Washington did is interesting because he was such a significant, influential figure in his own time and still in our own age. So once you get past the big biographies, I think the two most compelling, shorter single-volume biographies and readable biographies that'll give you kind of a tenor of the life as a whole in a more traditional biographical way would be Joe Ellis's His Excellency. And Joe has a particular emphasis on Washington's transformation from the ambitious, very ambitious young man to the man that we come and revere today. And then there's another one by a guy named John Rodhamel, called George Washington, The Wonder of the Age. Came out in 2016. Another really good short biography. But Rodhamel does something different than a lot of historians of Washington. He says, I'm not going to try to do too much with the private life of George Washington or the interior life of Washington, because George Washington actually is holding us all at a little bit of arm's length. But what Rodhamel's trying to say is, let's first understand why he was considered the wonder of his age. What was his public achievements in context? What did he achieve actually that made him the person that would be the name of the capital of a new nation, that would be this name that has lasted through the ages? And I think Rodhamel does it in a very balanced way based on a lot of the most recent scholarship. I want to mention two more, because I could go on, and I want to get to some other questions. But I really love Flora Fraser's work called The Washingtons, which is a study of the intimate life of George and Martha Washington. Flora is an extraordinary writer and biographer, researcher. She's a winner of the George Washington Book Prize for that study of the Washingtons. And she is tremendous with bringing out Martha out of the shadows a little bit. It's a little bit like the kind of painting where you have to paint around to see what's actually not there when you're dealing with women's history generally. And that's even the case with someone as famous as Martha, because so many of her letters were likely destroyed. But there are many that exist. There's over 500 or so. And the other thing that Flora really brings to a great attention is account books, material culture, place, a context of gender in the 18th century to really bring out the life of that extraordinary couple, really the first couple. And finally, I think I want to mention particularly Mary Thompson's work, which is a study of the enslaved community at Mount Vernon and George Washington's own mastery, his own struggle with being a slave owner, and his own evolution. It is a definitive study based on 30 years of work. Mary Thompson has been a member of the staff here at Mount Vernon for over 30 years, coming on 40 years this year. It's really a tremendous part of who we are. And the investment that the Ladies Association has made in trying to tell the story of enslaved, is really coming to show its great excellence in Mary Thompson's wonderful book. So I would encourage you to go out and get a copy of that as well. What other questions do we have?
Colleen wants to know, what was George Washington's view on vaccinations and public health? How did he put those ideas into practice in his leadership?
The question is about, Colleen asked a question about George Washington's views on vaccination and public health. Now, in George Washington's time, he knew of a practice called inoculation, which is not quite vaccination, which I'll let our real doctors, or let's say our MDs out there, step in to clarify the difference. But in the case of inoculation, we're talking about inoculation for smallpox. Smallpox was one of the most devastating diseases that was a regular companion to human beings through much of our history. And in the early modern world, in particular, it could spread very rapidly. As we know, smallpox was one of the virulent diseases that decimated the Native American population, which had had no exposure to it until Europeans arrived in North America. And so that's, you had these virgin epidemics on populations that had never been touched. Smallpox would destroy them. And similarly, you could have that with populations of Europeans or of anybody who were together in large groups who hadn't had exposure, and particularly in times of war. In the 18th century Europe, and as you saw the growth of urban areas, you'd get a lot of folks who are coming from rural areas, or soldiers who'd been farmers. They had no experience of being around a lot of other people, and all of a sudden they're together in one big group, and smallpox could hit and decimate an army. Smallpox won more victories than any general in the 18th century. And George Washington was himself a victim of smallpox. He didn't die. He got smallpox when he visited Barbados when he was 19 years old, which, by the way, we have a lovely Barbados diary of his trip there, which you can buy online at mountvernon.org/shops. A good purchase for everybody. But so he gets smallpox there, and it's really good for him because he survives it, and therefore he is inoculated against its effects for the rest of his life. So if you ever get smallpox and survive, you're safe. And so a practice, started in the early 18th century, really started seeing widespread use in North America in the 1720s. There was a big smallpox scare in New England, and there's a great public debate about whether or not to allow inoculation. But what inoculation was you would cut open the skin in an arm, likely, of a healthy person, and you would place live smallpox pustules into the skin. And what was shown is that would more often than not, the person would get smallpox, but it would be less virulent, less deadly than if you just randomly caught it in the normal fashion. And so if you inoculated, then you could somewhat, in a controlled environment where you have all the best medical care, which by our standards was terrible, but there's more likelihood that people would survive. And George Washington instituted smallpox inoculations at his army at Morristown and at other places during the American Revolution, because there was a tremendous smallpox outbreak during the American Revolution. There's a great book by a woman named Elizabeth Fenn, a historian. Elizabeth Fenn wrote a book called Pax Americana, which is a great study of the smallpox epidemic that ravaged North America, not just the battlefield area of the American Revolution, but much of it. In fact, the American Revolutionary War itself, the destiny of it was shaped a lot by disease and managing disease. Malaria was also a big player in the American Revolution, particularly devastating to the British Army as it marched through the South, trying to get to Yorktown. So the Yorktown Army that Cornwallis had, that ultimately was defeated by the Americans, was very much weakened by malaria that had been challenging those troops for a long time. So the story of infectious diseases and all kinds of diseases has been a tremendous impact in our history. Washington believed in inoculation. He believed in using the best, latest science to try to get an advantage, to try to protect lives. And he did. He saved lives because he inoculated people in the American Revolution. What other questions, Matt?
Well, Richard wants to know, what's the color of the mansion outside?
Yeah, great. So Richard asked a question about the color of the mansion outside. Now, this is a really important question. And the great thing is, here at Mount Vernon, we use the latest techniques, scientific, curatorial, archival, to find out the answer to that question. And so there's a lot of places we look to answer it. So the one thing we know is we of course, have the actual material culture of the mansion itself. So in fact, if I pulled off a board of the front of the mansion, this is the west front, so we call it. So the west front behind me, that board would be made of pine, yellow pine from this region that has been cut to look like stone. That process is called rustication. So you're taking a wood board, plank, making it look like cut stone blocks. That's rustication. Okay, that piece of board would have on it, maybe, if we're lucky, a remnant of the original paint that Washington used on the board. And that paint was also mixed with sand. Because George Washington not only wanted to cut the boards to look like stone, but he wanted them to be textured in a way so that they resembled stone. And so what he would have done is he would crush sandstone from Ukiah Creek sandstone, and he would throw it or have slaves or other folks throw it onto the boards while the boards were wet with paint, with a white paint at the time. And then he would have linseed oil involved. And anyway, he would secure it all on there. And we have remnants of that. So we know exactly what kind of stone he used. We know what kind of paint he used, and we've replicated it. In fact, last year, when you came this time of year, you might have seen scaffolding going up on the west front, because we did a whole process of restoring the west front of the mansion last year. We stripped every board down to the original board. We documented which ones were original. And if you can believe it, 83% of the wood on the west front of the mansion is from George Washington's time. And the vast majority of the nails are 18th century nails. It's really spectacular. And so we recreated the process that is well documented in George Washington's own correspondence of how he wanted this done. Matt's having some troubles. Are we okay? We're good. So Washington describes how he wanted this done, and we recreated it essentially the same way. So it creates a sort of a tan look to the mansion. Now, a lot of people, when Mount Vernon first started doing this research and first started recreating this method, might have been shocked to see, because they think of the mansion as white. And indeed, it looks white. It looks white from a distance, a little off-white, tannish. But also all the images of Mount Vernon that you would see, from 2007 and before, are of this bright, brilliant white house. Now, that kind of white couldn't be produced in the 18th century. The zinc required in the paint to make it this brilliant white didn't exist until the 19th century. So there's no way George Washington had a brilliant white house. And in fact, when you go back and do the methods that he used and go back and look at what people actually said about the house, this sort of modeled appearance of stone is more accurate to what he would have known. I think we can still fight over which looks better, but I think that as a whole, when we fully restore it, you see the whiter windows, you see the whiter cupola. These are areas that don't always have the same sand on them, and they really pop. So it gives it a little bit of texture and proportionality to it that would have been very appealing to George Washington's eye. What other questions do we got?
Well, Leslie Ann wants to know, do you think the original house looked a lot like a small house behind you next to the mansion, the servants' hall?
Oh, right. Oh, great question. So the question is, did the original house kind of look like the small house to the right of the mansion house? That's called the servants' hall. That's where the servants of guests of Washington stayed when they were here. That's what it was called in Washington's time. Many of those folks would have been enslaved. Some wouldn't have been, though, as well. So a hall for your guests to keep their valets. Very nice to have. Particularly when you're trying to space people out. Now, in this case, I think the original house would have looked something like that. That is a representation that we show online when the garret was there, but not necessarily a full upstairs, where you have the Virginia architectural construction is very similar, all over this region, and so it's pretty easy to see what it would have been, and the scale is likely about right. It might have been a little bit bigger than that hall. And that's a really good question. What other questions, Matt?
Emily wants to know, what's your favorite part of the property?
Emily wants to know what's my favorite part of the property. I live here on the estate. I have a great privilege as being the 11th resident director of Mount Vernon. There's only been 11 since 1860 because one guy had the job for 52 years and another one had it for 40 years. Now, I don't think I'm going to be here quite that long, but I do get the opportunity to live here and see all the nooks and crannies of the estate. To have one favorite is very challenging. Let me give you two favorites. One is the piazza and the view of the river. Now, one of these shows will have to do it from the other side so we can talk about how important our preservation of that extraordinary view is, the story of how the Ladies Association did it and how we still do it, but also really just bask in it and let it roll over us. This extraordinary sense of time being lost, the sense that you're in a place that has lasted from time immemorial, a place where thousands, millions of other people have enjoyed that same view with their families over time. It's a tremendous amount of continuity, and I always get inspired to be out there. But also, of course, one of the things to remember about why Mount Vernon exists today is because it was so important to the American people, is because the tomb of George Washington and Martha Washington is here. And so it was a site of pilgrimage for Americans and for lovers of liberty around the world before the Mount Vernon Ladies Association even saved the house in the 1850s. So because the tomb is here, the tomb connects us directly to the remains of George Washington. He was a real man who lived in challenging times. We are like him. We are the same, and we can draw from the successes and the failures and the weaknesses of his own struggles, and achieve great things. So the tomb is always a really powerful place for me to visit on the estate.
Great. Brandon wants to know, what's the current temperature? It looks very springy.
Brandon wants to know the current temperature. It is got to be 65 degrees if it's 30 degrees. It is beautiful. It might be approaching 70. There's a slight breeze right now, which probably keeps it down.
63.
Okay, Matt Briney just checked in on the magic box, and he tells me 63. So that's pretty good. 65 is a pretty good guess. I'll take that any day of the week. You're welcome. But it's gorgeous here, and my only regret is that you can't be here with me, and we have to do this remotely. But it is so important that we do try to maintain all of our quarantines and social distancing and shutdowns and all those things so that we can get through this more quickly and with less pain and with less sickness. And so we are happy to be doing our part, even though we're sad that you can't see the beautiful grounds right now. Questions? Anything else, Matt? So as we are waiting in this moment, as the queue is opened up a little bit, let me talk a little bit about Mount Vernon, how it's evolved over the years. So this structure exists today because of the incredible leadership and foresight of a remarkable woman named Anne Pamela Cunningham, who started a national movement to organize a group of women first but then the rest of the nation to rally around and figure out a way to buy this extraordinary estate when it was about to fall to dust. The last Washington owner of Mount Vernon was John Augustine Washington III. He was the great-great-grandnephew of George Washington. George Washington didn't have any increase of his body, as they say in the law, and so he gave the estate to Bushrod Washington, who was a Supreme Court justice for over 30 years on the Marshall Court, an interesting character in his own right. Bushrod also didn't have any children that he designated as his heirs, and so he gave it to his nephew, John Augustine Washington II, and John Augustine Washington died young, and his wife took care of Mount Vernon for at least a decade and a half. And then it descended to John Augustine Washington III, who ultimately sold it to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Now, John Augustine Washington III had a lot of land, not only here, but in other places in Virginia and in what's now West Virginia as well. And so this was not a main farm for him, but yet he had to maintain it because it had become this destination spot, this shrine to George Washington, and the family tomb was here. Ultimately, it was becoming impossible to maintain this wooden structure behind us. I mean, think about Virginia's weather, the heat and humidity, the extremes of cold that can happen in this region. It takes a battering as it is, and we have modern techniques. Imagine yourself in the 19th century trying to keep up this extraordinary place in the face of tourists randomly rolling through and taking pieces of buildings as souvenirs and all this. He couldn't manage it. And so he was looking to unload it and sell it. He tried to sell it to the national government. He tried to sell it to the state government. They had no interest in taking care of it. And so that was when Anne Pamela Cunningham, famously rallying to the cry, if the men of America won't save the house of the father of their country, then the women shall. And they did. And of course, this is at a time not only could women not vote, but most women couldn't even own property in their own right outside of marriage or in marriage. And so it was really an extraordinary thing for her to organize this group, which we now know as the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. That is the name of our corporation. We're completely private. We're not a national park. We are owned by this private group. The board is still the Mount Vernon Ladies. There's one lady per state, but not from every state. Our current regent right now is the vice regent from Pennsylvania, Sarah Colson, and their leadership has been crucial to maintaining this place for 160 years since we first opened it up to guests. So this is our 160th year in 2020. I'd prefer a different year. As of right now, it's looking pretty challenging, but we're going to get through it, and we're going to last another 160 years. We're built to last. Our mission is to maintain this place and to teach people all over the world. One final thing I'll say is that the Ladies Association has expanded its role as a cultural institution and as an educational institution. Since 1860, we've had about 90 million visitors to Mount Vernon under the operation of Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Last year, we had over 1 million visitors, 350,000 school kids. But beginning in the 1990s, we really expanded our education efforts on the estate. We built a pioneer farm to show practices of 18th century agriculture, since George Washington was an innovative agricultural reformist. We built, for instance, an example of his 16-sided barn, which he designed when he was president. A barn that's really designed to maximize the efficiency of threshing your wheat. So you can put the wheat and have it run on by horses that run around, and then the little wheat seeds fall through the floor to the bottom, and it's the first separation of the wheat from the chaff, which then happens by hand. Really an extraordinary, remarkable building. We acquired George Washington's original grist mill, which was rebuilt in the 1930s and now restored it to be a functioning grist mill, which you can visit when we reopen, and you can see it online. We also then began a process of teaching teachers from all over the country, what we call our Teacher Institute. Now we bring 160 teachers a year to Mount Vernon to learn about best practices and how to teach the founding, how to teach slavery, how to teach objects, how to teach primary sources. A lot of these resources are online, as I mentioned earlier. And then, of course, we opened a museum and education center, or 2 museums, really, in 2006. With movies and 4D movies where it snows on you when you cross the Delaware with George Washington, even in 100 degrees in August. And then on the heels of that, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association said, Well, what we need now is a good drink. So they started distilling whiskey in 2007, 2008, when we reopened George Washington's distillery. Did you know, and I bet you didn't, that he was the largest distiller of whiskey anywhere in the country that we can find in 1799? Produced 11,000 gallons, and we produce whiskey right now from his reconstructed distillery, which is based on the exact archaeology footprint of the original. And then on the heels of that, the Ladies Association weren't done. We opened the first presidential library for George Washington in 2013. It was my great honor to be the founding director of that library. I came down from Binghamton University, where I was a professor of history, to become the first director of that library before I took on this role as CEO. And let me tell you, that library has really made us a powerhouse of research as we've invested in scholarship. We've invested in making sure our own archives are in great order, and we've invested in education. And a lot of these digital items you see out there are only possible because of the expertise that the library has allowed us to marshal. So it's a great place and an extensive place that has changed through the years, all driven by the leadership of an extraordinary group of women.
Do you have more questions, Doug?
More questions.
Scott asked, are there plans in the future to stream a tour of the mansion?
Scott asked, are there plans in the future to stream a tour of the mansion? On Monday, we're going to start doing that. And every Monday, we're going to have Mansion Mondays, and we're going to look at individual rooms and take our time. We have time. We have all the time that we can count right now. So we want to make sure we give justice to the work our curators have done to tell great stories as if you are going through the mansion. Now, in the meantime, if you're really hankering and got to get something, make sure you go to the Mount Vernon .org/digital page where you can find our virtual tour, and you yourself can virtually go through. One of these days we'll have a headset you can wear and walk around the mansion virtually as well. But this is the next best thing to that. And we've often said it's the next best thing to actually coming to Mount Vernon. So enjoy all the resources of the virtual tour. Matt, I have to scratch my nose, so everybody look away for a second. Don't worry, I'll wash before I go anywhere.
Bo wanted to know, how much did it cost to build the mansion?
Bo asked a really difficult question and a great question about how much it cost to build the mansion. We don't know. We don't have numbers for that. It cost a lot in labor and time and cash. And Washington had to do it over a long period of time. So his first changes were in the 1750s. Some of the changes he did in the 1750s was really to beautify it. Because he was about to marry a woman who was much wealthier than him, who was used to living with finer things than him. So he redoes the interior of the central passage to make it, look very nice. He also puts in this extraordinary balcony made out of mahogany. Not balcony, banister, railing for the stairs. Balcony. So a railing made out of a beautiful piece of mahogany. That was expensive in and of itself. And so he puts the amount of money he can put in it when he can. And you could clearly see he's got plans for its future. Some people often have asked me, well, it's a good thing that the British didn't burn Mount Vernon during the American Revolutionary War, when in fact there was a chance that they might have. There was obviously the British controlled the waves in the 18th century, and they controlled much of the sea power for most of the story, including ships right out here on the Potomac, and threatened to burn Mount Vernon. But in fact, at the time, George Washington's nephew, Lund Washington, or maybe he's his cousin, he was managing the estate. He made a deal with the British captain to give provision to the crew so that they wouldn't destroy the estate. And George Washington was furious at this. He was furious at it because it was a PR disaster, first of all. It's like, here, people are suffering, and here I am making a special side deal so that my house doesn't get burnt down, and giving aid and comfort to the enemy, even worse. But I think he also was furious because he wanted to build a mansion in brick. He wanted to build it in stone, but he never had the money to just kind of raise it and start over. But if it was burnt down during the American Revolution, I guarantee you Congress would have paid for him to build the house of his dreams. And that would be the house we'd be looking at today. So God knows how much it costs. That's a good question for a future intrepid researcher right here at the Washington Library.
So Doug, our Teacher Institute wants to know, what is something you want all students to know about Washington?
Well, when you think about why does Washington matter, I think we're living through a moment when it's as relevant as ever to think about what we can do to serve our communities. George Washington was a man who thought about public service and stepped up in moments when other people didn't want to step up. He didn't want to step up. He was a reluctant leader. He had other ambitions than becoming the president of the United States, for instance. He wanted to be an agriculturalist. That's where his heart was. But the community needed him, and he stepped up. And I think a great lesson that we can learn is the idea of virtue that Washington lived in. For Washington, virtue meant service in the cause of the community, disinterested service, so selflessness in the cause of someone else. This is a moment where that message is important, and it's in our DNA. Our nation is based on sacrifices that people have made every generation so that other people could live and other people could live a better life. It's a fundamental part of the only way that democracy can work. It needs these kinds of sacrifices. It needs people willing to serve the public. And of course, we see it all the day. We see it in all the people in uniform. We're seeing it with the folks who are rushing in and taking care of people in the hospitals right now. I mean, that sense of public virtue is a lesson, I hope, that will carry through to all school kids. And so that's a good one to focus on right now.
Doug Laura wants to know, has George Washington ever faced a crisis as big as the pandemic is today?
Well, that's a good question. Has George Washington ever faced a crisis as big? George Washington never faced a crisis like this. All crises have their different dynamics, but he definitely faced a crisis as big as this. I mean, the American Revolutionary War was a war that lasted for 8 years, in which they fought on against tremendous odds all alone. The crisis of independence, of winning the peace after American independence, was probably even harder. And we've seen so many republics that have failed once they gained their independence, failed to maintain the rule of law, failed to establish lasting institutions, the effort to create the Constitution, and then to breathe it life, give life to it, as he did through his presidency. That was a tremendous crisis. The economy of the United States was decimated after the American Revolution. There was no money circulating. There were no markets for people to sell anything. And what they needed was confidence, and they needed institution building to make it happen. And George Washington, again, stepped up with other leaders to try to make that happen. And ultimately, it always depended upon the resilience of the people. We are a democracy that depends upon popular opinion and popular action. And so individual leaders themselves are crucial, but always there's the dynamic of a give and take, of the followers and the led, and the leaders listening to the followers, and the followers acting. And that's the democratic model. Has been messy and challenging and chaotic, and it's a challenge to lead Americans. George Washington would say that as much as anybody. Americans are notorious, independent-minded people who want to do their own thing. When he was trying to run the government as president, he's dealing with a population that had just fought a big revolution because they didn't want to pay their taxes. I mean, this is a really intractable problem to lead, but what it requires is it requires all of us, essentially. It requires all of us to get together and work together. So Washington lived through harrowing times, certainly as harrowing as we have right now, and we will get through this as well.
Adam wants to know, any thoughts about Washington's response to the yellow fever in 1793?
Good question, Adam. On the yellow fever in 1793, which swept through Philadelphia and a lot of other urban areas. Yellow fever is mosquito-borne, but at the time they thought it kind of came from the ground or came from bad air. It wasn't really clear. I mean, in Washington's era, they had no sense of diseases or germs or viruses. Even in the Spanish flu, the notion of a virus didn't exist. They still were trying to figure out if it was bad air or what it was that caused this. So the yellow fever epidemic was scary and devastating. The population of Philadelphia at the time was about 30,000. 5,000 people died. Think about that death rate in the context of a human being struggling with fear and uncertainty. Washington had to move the Congress out of the Capitol, first to Germantown, and then I think they went even further afield after that, or they recessed early, and George Washington came back to Mount Vernon. So the yellow fever epidemic was a brutal thing. Now, interestingly, John Adams would later write that the yellow fever epidemic in 1793 was the only thing that saved the country from having a political revolution. because that was a moment of high partisanship when people were fighting over the French Revolution, whether it was a good thing and whether it was a bad thing, whether Americans should be on the side of the French or on the side of all the princes of Europe, whether there were people in the country that wanted to tear down the new institutions of government and create a French-style republic. And it was really dangerous. There were people marching in the streets. It was a time of high passion, high political passion. And the yellow fever epidemic came and everybody left and the conversation changed. It is interesting to see. We don't know what's going to happen next week, next year. And like Washington, we have to make decisions based on the best that we know and the best we can at the time.
Shauna wants to know, do we know any George Washington wanted to make a state but didn't get a chance to do, things he didn't get to do?
Oh, questions that George Washington didn't get a chance to do here at Mount Vernon. Yeah, I mean, this is a really good and challenging question. One of the things he always wanted to do was to get his Western lands profitable. He had Mount Vernon here in Virginia on the Potomac, but he had been acquiring land out what for him was the far west in his time, all the way back to the French and Indian War. He'd been acquiring land because of his service there. The colony of Virginia provided land bounties, and he had purchased land as well because he thought that's the future of the country. People are moving west. This land he had there will appreciate in value as people move out there. He had a grist mill on the Potomac that was much further west from here. He had rental properties, and these never really played out for him the way he wanted. And in fact, in the last 2 years of his life, he was making plans to try to figure out a way to make them more profitable or to sell them. I think the bigger issue, though, and one that's probably most controversial, is what was he going to do about slavery in his time, if anything? Now, we know that George Washington is already saying in the 1780s, it's recorded that he's having conversations in which he's saying that he hopes that slavery will be ended by legislation, that he wants to try not to ever have to sell a man and a woman again. He's never going to purchase any more slaves again if he can help it, and that he thinks the institution needs to go, but it needs to go through a legislative process. When he's in the 1790s, when he's president of a country that has a constitution that was based on a deal between slave owners and non-slave owners to assure that slavery wouldn't be an issue of the federal government where it existed in his time. And so the issues that are gonna come with slavery that's going to ultimately divide the Union are actually about what happens in the territories. Remember, the country's really going to split on what happens to slavery on the later territories. That's not really an issue in Washington's time yet because they don't have later territories yet making those decisions. So the slavery question is one that he's dealing with personally in the 1790s. He draws a beautiful map and survey of the Mount Vernon estates. It's the one that shows everything he had. He prepared this to send to Englishmen and English agriculturalists with a plan whereby he was hoping he could attract English tenants that would come and take control of his outer properties and possibly figure out a way to free his enslaved people gradually as tenant farmers or sharecroppers or apprentices on that land. It's not dissimilar for what the West Indies ultimately does in the 1830s when they emancipate slaves in the West Indies. It's sort of gradual process. Now, Washington didn't get any takers, and he never was able to put any of those plans in place. So whether he would have continued trying to do that or not, we just don't know. He died. What we do know is he had a will in which he freed all the slaves that he owned personally at the time of Martha's death, but that was guaranteed in the will. He also provided pensions for them and training for younger formerly enslaved people. The great tragedy, though, of course, is he couldn't figure out how to stop from separating families ultimately because he didn't control all the slaves that lived in Mount Vernon. They were owned by the estate of the Custis family. Martha Washington had a dower's right, meaning a lifetime right to use their labor. But once she passed away, the right of them went to the Custis heirs. And because of that, and because they had intermarried with people in George Washington's ownership, there was a tragic separation of families, even with the freeing of the 150 odd that George Washington freed, both here and an estate he owned on the York River. So that's one of the things I think he wanted to figure out that he didn't live long enough to do.
So Doug, Jack wants to know, what do you think Washington would say to his fellow citizens in this current crisis?
Jack wants to know what Washington would say to his fellow citizens in this current crisis. I think he would say, our cause is a noble cause. It's the cause of all mankind. It's a quote that he said oftentimes in talking about the cause of liberty. In this case, we really are in it together all over the world in fighting this thing. And that's a thing that George Washington would emphasize. He also would emphasize patience and fortitude and sacrifice. Patience in the idea that we all have to be humble in the way that we walk forward in a time when you can't control events and you're doing the best you can. Patience with our leaders, patience with our friends, our colleagues, as we work towards this. Perseverance and resilience, always a message that he would emphasize in these times. And he'd rally the people to it, and he would never give up. And Washington would do that by his example as much as with his words. The thing about Washington, think about him as a leader. One of the things is he showed up. He showed up when he was called, and he was there when he was needed. He was always with his troops through 8 years of the war. He was there. There's no other general in the 18th century who went on an 8-year campaign that spent all their time with their troops without taking a furlough, without taking some time away, without wintering somewhere more comfortable. That was what was typical amongst European armies. Washington was there at Valley Forge, at Morristown, in Jockey Hollow, on the Hudson River. He was with everybody throughout the thing. And I think that that shows the perseverance and the character of the man. And that's in all of us as our inheritance. He's the father of our country. Those are things we all can draw on in any challenging time.
Kathy wants to know, how did George Washington decompress while president during these trying times?
Good question. How did George Washington decompress during trying times? Well, he came to Mount Vernon to decompress. He didn't have a Camp David at the time when he was president. And so he would take essentially vacations. Now, he had work to do here as well, but he was back amongst his family and friends. He's back amongst his local community. He stopped fox hunting, which was one of his great pleasures and pastimes about the time he became president. Partly had to do with his own health, but also had to do with time. He always enjoyed the land. He always enjoyed agriculture. His pleasure reading would be the latest treatise on farming or the Farmer's Almanac. He really lived and breathed living things. How to design better crop rotations so that they would be effective. This is really what got his it brought down his temper and irritability. It was a chance for himself to work through some of these problems. It's interesting because, he entertained a lot, and it's clear he didn't like to entertain. He's not the guy who would have been the life of the party. Partly because everybody wants a piece of him for some reason, and they want him to perform, and they want to know anecdotes. General, will you favor us with an anecdote of the wartime period? He's not going to make a joke. He's not going to do that. And so, in fact, what we do see are a lot of sour complaints about Washington at the dinner table or sitting in a room when everybody's having a glass of wine after dinner. The general always seems a little aloof, standoffish, quiet. He will only talk about things like agriculture and not about battles or politics or stuff like that. So I think we get a real sense of the man's personality through these kinds of descriptions. But you got to also remember, in Washington's defense, he was, I think, naturally taciturn and quiet and didn't like to show off in public, partly because he was insecure about his own education, but also because he was humble and he liked to listen to people and observe people. But also, towards the end of his life, he's got these teeth. He's got no teeth in his mouth, and it's painful for him to have to, to show that and reveal that kind of frailty. And so I think he feels better off just staying silent. There's that great old adage, it's better to stay silent and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and to prove everyone right. And so clearly that's not a problem I have. I've been talking nonstop. But Washington was a much more humble man than I am. So,
Doug Joe wants to know, I know things are still very fluid, but when do you think Mount Vernon will open again?
It's a good question from Joe. Things are very fluid. When might Mount Vernon open again? It's a really good question, and we're not prepared to pick a date at this time. We certainly can't predict the future any better than anybody else, and so we're going to stay responsive. It changed day by day last week. I mean, if you would ask me Tuesday last week, do you think you're going to need to close? I would have said no, probably not. We might see a fall off in visitation, and we'll practice some social distancing. We'll maybe cancel some events. But by Wednesday it was clear we were going to need to close. And then by Friday it was clear that we needed to keep all staff away, let alone close. And so it's a moving target, and we're gonna keep our eye on it and listen to what the CDC recommends, listen to what Fairfax County health officials recommend, and be a good player and a good part of the community in this. The questions there, Matt? Or is it time to say farewell?
Time to wrap up, Doug.
Well, I've got a few other things to get back to, as you might imagine. I really appreciate you spending time with me. You can always ask any other questions. Just shoot them in to the link that you'll find with this video, and spread the word. Mount Vernon's live every day, well, every weekday, Monday through Friday, at noon with a new conversation. And luckily for you, a new face to look at too. So thank you so much, and I'll see you soon at Mount Vernon.